3 days after I buried my wife, my son placed a stack of papers in front of me and said, "Dad, Mom wanted us to move on." I signed them. 3 weeks later, I discovered that the house Margaret and I had spent 38 years building together had been sold, and more than $600,000 from the sale had been transferred into a real estate project controlled by my daughter-in-law's father. But that was not the part that hurt the most. The part that changed something inside me was learning that my son had started planning the sale before his mother was even dead. My name is Thomas Bennett. I am 72 years old, and for 41 years I worked as a bridge engineer for the state of Colorado. I spent my career studying stress, pressure, and structural failure. One thing I learned early was that bridges almost never collapse because of one enormous mistake. They fail because small cracks are ignored until the weight becomes too much. I wish I had understood sooner that families work the same way. Margaret and I were married for 38 years. We bought our ranch house outside Loveland when our son Ryan was still small enough to fall asleep against my shoulder after dinner. The place was nothing special when we bought it. A leaking roof, crooked porch, unfinished basement, and 2 acres of stubborn Colorado soil. But we built our life into it one piece at a time. I repaired the foundation. Margaret chose the cedar cabinets. I built the sunroom. She planted 2 maple trees outside the kitchen window. Every anniversary we added something small. A rose bed, a stone bench, a porch swing. By the time we reached retirement, the house was no longer something I measured in dollars. It was 38 years of marriage standing on a foundation. Then Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. 8 months later, she was gone. In those final months, Ryan seemed like the son I had always hoped I raised. He brought groceries, drove his mother to appointments, fixed things around the house, and stood beside her funeral with his arm around my shoulders. "I've got you, Dad," he whispered. I believed him because grief makes a man desperate to believe he still belongs to someone. Claire, his wife, began talking about the house almost immediately. She never demanded anything. Claire was too polished for that. She worked in commercial real estate and had a gift for making an idea sound reasonable before you realized it was not yours. 2 days after the funeral, she stood by the kitchen window looking across Margaret's maple trees and said, "This is a lot of property for one person, Thomas." I told her I was not ready to discuss it. The next afternoon, Ryan arrived alone with papers. He said they were meant to let him help with the insurance, taxes, bank, and property matters while I recovered. I had spent 4 decades telling young engineers never to sign anything they had not personally checked. Yet I barely looked at those pages. I was staring at Margaret's empty chair when Ryan leaned toward me and said, "Dad, Mom wanted us to move on. She wouldn't want you trapped here." He knew exactly which words would get my signature, so I signed. Ryan gathered the papers and left. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then strangers began stopping outside my house. One man photographed the roof. A couple in an SUV slowed down and pointed toward the property. Then I noticed a lockbox attached to the side gate. I called Ryan twice. No answer. The following afternoon, a woman from a closing company knocked on my door holding a clipboard. "Mr. Bennett, I just need to confirm the property will be vacant by the possession date." I stared at her. "What possession date?" Her expression changed immediately. She looked down at her paperwork. "Sir, the sale closed yesterday." I remember putting one hand against the doorframe because suddenly my legs felt unreliable. "What sale?" She showed me the first page, my address, my property, my name, and attached beneath it was a power of attorney carrying my signature. I closed the door, walked to the kitchen, and sat at the same table where I had signed those documents. Then I called Ryan. This time he answered. His first words were, "Dad, before you get upset, let me explain." I knew then there was nothing left to misunderstand. The house had sold for a little over $800,000. After fees, taxes, and the remaining mortgage, more than $600,000 remained. Ryan told me the money had been invested into a luxury development near Breckenridge, being launched by Claire's father, Douglas Mercer. He called it an opportunity. He said Douglas could double the money within 18 months. He said I would never have to worry about retirement again. Then he used Margaret's name. "Mom would wanted you secure." I let him finish. I did not yell. Anger has never helped me understand a failing structure. I asked only one question. "When did you start planning this?" Ryan went silent. "When, son?" he exhaled. "About 6 weeks ago." I looked toward the kitchen window. Margaret had been dead for 3 weeks. 6 weeks meant Ryan had been discussing the sale while his mother was still alive, while I was helping her out of bed, while she was struggling through chemotherapy, while he was sitting beside her telling her everything would be all right. That realization did not make me furious. It made me cold. There is a point in a man's life when disappointment becomes too heavy for anger. "I have to go," I said. "Dad, please." I ended the call. For the rest of that afternoon, I sat alone while the sunlight moved across the floor Margaret had chosen 27 years earlier. I kept thinking about bridges, about cracks, about all the small warnings I had explained away because admitting what they meant would have hurt too much. At 6:12 that evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Harold Finch, Margaret's attorney. I had not spoken to him in years, Mr. Bennett, he said. I'm sorry about Margaret, but I need you to come to my office tomorrow. Something in his voice made me sit straighter. Why? There was a brief silence. Your wife left instructions with me. She was very specific about when I was allowed to contact you. I looked at Margaret's empty chair. When was that? Harold lowered his voice. If anyone ever attempted to sell the house, my hand tightened around the phone. Then he said, Mr. Bennett, there is something Margaret never told you. The next morning, I drove to Harold Finch's office with Margaret's last instructions still circling in my head. If anyone ever attempted to sell the house. Harold had handled our wills for years and had the habit of removing his glasses before saying anything difficult. When I sat across from him, he opened a locked drawer, took out a cream envelope, and placed it between us. My name was written on the front in Margaret's handwriting. I knew that handwriting from birthday cards, grocery lists, and notes tucked into my lunch. Seeing my name written by a hand that no longer existed hurt in a way Ryan's betrayal had not. Harold folded his hands. She gave me this 4 months before she died, he said. She made me promise not to contact you unless the house was sold, transferred, or placed under outside control. I stared at him. She knew? He shook his head. She suspected. He told me Margaret had come alone and asked about powers of attorney, property transfers, and whether an adult child could move assets if a parent signed broad enough authority. She never accused Ryan directly, but she mentioned Claire more than once. Margaret believed Claire was pushing Ryan toward a life built on money, status, and connections. She was worried he was changing, Harold said. Not because Claire controlled him, because Ryan wanted what her family represented. I thought about the way my son had used Margaret's name to get my signature. Harold pushed the envelope closer. She also said that if this happened, you would want to fight. She knew you well. I opened it. Inside was a 2-page letter and a small brass key wrapped in tissue paper. The letter began, Thomas, if you are reading this, then something I was afraid of has happened. I stopped and pressed my thumb against the paper. Margaret wrote that she had watched Ryan change over the previous 2 years. It had not happened suddenly. Old friends became small town. Family dinners became obligations. Every new conversation seemed to be about investors, property, influence, or people who could open doors. Claire had not created every weakness in him, Margaret wrote, but she knew how to feed the ones already there. Then came a sentence that sounded so much like my that I had to look away. Do not make Claire into a monster just because it would be easier than admitting our son made choices of his own. Margaret believed Claire's father, Douglas Mercer, had been encouraging Ryan to identify idle family assets that could be moved into his development projects. She had overheard a conversation in our kitchen months before her illness became severe. Ryan had not agreed to sell the house then, but Margaret had seen something in his expression that frightened her. Interest. She wrote that if the house had been sold, I should not spend what remained of my life trying to destroy anyone. Do not chase them, Thomas. Do not beg. Do not threaten. Do not turn grief into revenge. Truth has a way of finding daylight when people build too much on top of it. Let the truth come to you. I lowered the letter. Why didn't she tell me? Harold answered softly. She said you were already carrying enough. That was Margaret, protecting me while she was dying. I looked at the brass key. It was scratched along one edge with the number 314 stamped into the head. What does this open? Harold shook his head. She wouldn't tell me. She said you would know when you were ready. Then I remembered a place Margaret and I had not visited in almost 15 years, a private storage facility outside Loveland, where she once kept documents from her father's estate. Unit 314. I drove there directly from Harold's office. The manager checked my ID, then returned with an authorization card carrying Margaret's signature. Your wife prepaid the unit through next year, she said. That stopped me. Margaret had known exactly how long she wanted whatever was inside protected. The manager led me down a concrete hallway lined with gray metal doors until we reached 314. The brass key turned smoothly. Inside was almost nothing. One metal filing cabinet, a wooden chair, and a compact fireproof safe bolted to the floor. No furniture, no family boxes, just the safe. Taped to the top was a white index card in Margaret's handwriting. Thomas, open this before you decide what kind of man our son has become. I sat on the chair for several minutes before touching it. The same key opened the safe. For one foolish second, I expected money, jewelry, maybe bonds or some hidden account she had never told me about. Instead, there was only one object inside, a black leather notebook, worn at the corners and thick with handwritten pages. I lifted it out and opened to the first page. At the top, Margaret had written a date from almost 2 years earlier. Underneath it were 4 words that made my stomach tighten. Ryan met Douglas today. I did not read the entire notebook that day. I could not. Margaret had filled nearly 200 pages, each one dated, each one written in the careful hand she used when she wanted facts to survive emotion. There were notes about Ryan, Claire, Douglas Mercer, dinners I had forgotten, phone calls Margaret had overheard, and names I did not recognize. I was sitting at my kitchen table the next morning with the black notebook closed beside my coffee when someone knocked on the front door. The man standing outside was in his late 50s, tall, gray at the temples, wearing a dark wool coat that looked too expensive for a quiet street outside Loveland. He studied my face for a second, then smiled in a way that made 30 years disappear. "Mr. Bennett?" I looked at him harder. Something about his eyes was familiar. "Jonathan?" His smile broke wider. Jonathan Hale. I had not seen him since 1994. Back then he had been a 22-year-old civil engineering intern from Illinois, skinny, brilliant, stubborn, and determined to prove that asking for help was a form of weakness. He had spent one summer assigned to my bridge inspection team near Glenwood Springs. On a hot afternoon in July, a temporary access platform failed beneath him during a structural survey. He slipped through a gap between two support beams and caught one arm on a steel brace above a 40-foot drop. I was 6 feet away. I grabbed the back of his safety harness before the second buckle tore loose and held him against the beam until 2 workers could pull us both back. He broke his wrist. I tore something in my shoulder that bothered me for years. Jonathan always called it the day I saved his life. I always told him the harness saved his life and I happened to be standing nearby. He never accepted that version. "What are you doing in Colorado?" I asked. "I flew in from Chicago last night." He hesitated. "I heard about Margaret. That softened something in me." I stepped aside and let him in. He stopped when he saw her photograph on the bookshelf, the one taken on our 35th anniversary, and stood there quietly for a moment before saying, "She always sent me a Christmas card. I did not know that." Margaret had apparently kept in touch with more pieces of my old life than I had. Jonathan sat at the kitchen table and told me what the last 30 years had done to him. He had finished school, moved into infrastructure finance, then private equity, and eventually founded Hale Meridian Capital in Chicago. I knew the name. Anyone who followed business news did. They managed billions in pension and infrastructure funds, invested in logistics, energy, housing, and major real estate developments across the Midwest and Mountain West. Jonathan said it without pride, like a man reading weather numbers. "I got lucky," he said. "You worked hard," I answered. He shook his head. "Both can be true." That sounded more like the boy I remembered. Then his expression changed. "Thomas, I didn't come here only because of Margaret." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim folder. "We're reviewing a development outside Breckenridge. Luxury residences, private club, commercial village, mountain access. Around $400 million at full build-out." I already knew the answer before he said the name. Mercer Ridge. Jonathan looked surprised. "You know it?" I glanced at the black notebook. "More than I did a week ago." He opened the folder. Douglas Mercer's photograph was clipped to the first page. Same silver hair, same measured smile I had seen at Ryan and Claire's wedding. Jonathan explained that Hale Meridian had been approached to provide the final capital commitment. Without their money, the project could still move forward, but much more slowly and at much greater risk. Douglas had been pushing hard for approval. "We were supposed to make a preliminary decision Friday," Jonathan said. "But one of my analysts found inconsistencies in the investor structure. Nothing illegal on its face, just enough layering to make me uncomfortable." I said nothing. He turned several pages. There were corporations, holding companies, limited partnerships, and investor names. Then he stopped. His finger rested halfway down a page. I saw his eyes narrow. "Ryan Bennett." My chest tightened. Jonathan looked at me. I nodded once. He stared at the document again. I didn't know. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by the precise stillness of a man who had spent decades making expensive decisions. "He's listed as an advisory investor through Mercer Alpine Holdings." "He sold my house," I said. Jonathan looked up sharply. I told him everything, not every detail, only what mattered. Margaret's death, the papers, the power of attorney, the sale, the $600,000, Douglas Mercer's project. Jonathan did not interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back and rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Does Ryan know I'm involved?" "I don't think Ryan knows you exist." Jonathan stood and walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, Margaret's maple trees were bare against the pale Colorado morning. "Thomas, I need to be careful here." He turned toward me. "I owe you more than I could ever repay, but I will not punish your son because of our history. If Hale Meridian walks away from this deal, it has to be because the deal deserves it." "That is exactly what I want," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You mean that? I spent 41 years signing reports that could close bridges, cost contractors millions, or stop construction. If the numbers were safe, I signed. If they weren't, I didn't. The name on the project never mattered." Jonathan gave a slow nod. Then his eyes moved to the black notebook beside my coffee. "What is that?" I hesitated, then pushed it across the table. Something Margaret left behind. He did not open it. Do you want me to? Not yet. I turned the folder toward myself and found Ryan's name again. Beneath it was another detail I had not expected. His contribution had been recorded almost 2 months earlier. I felt the air leave my lungs. 2 months. That meant Ryan had not merely discussed selling the house 6 weeks before Margaret died. He had apparently committed money to Mercer Ridge before he actually had the money. Jonathan saw my face. What is it? I pointed to the date. He read it twice. Then he opened his laptop, signed into a secure portal, and began searching through transaction notes while I sat in silence. After several minutes, he stopped typing. His expression hardened. There's more. What? He rotated the screen toward me. Ryan's name appeared beside an internal memo from Douglas Mercer's team. It described my house proceeds as anticipated family liquidity pledged toward an investor contribution. The memo was dated while Margaret was still undergoing treatment. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jonathan closed the laptop very slowly. Thomas, he said, I need my legal and compliance teams to verify this before I say anything else. He picked up the folder, but before placing it back into his briefcase, he looked at Ryan's name one final time. Because if this is the same Ryan Bennett listed in these files, he paused. Everything changes. 2 days after Jonathan left my kitchen, I stood in the driveway of the house Margaret and I had built and realized I no longer had the right to walk back inside. The new owners had agreed to give me 72 hours to remove my personal things before possession changed hands, which was generous under the circumstances and still felt like being politely evicted from my own life. I packed slowly. Margaret's wedding album, her recipe box, a framed photograph of Ryan at 8 years old sitting on my shoulders at Rocky Mountain National Park, the small ceramic bird she bought in Santa Fe because she said every kitchen needed one useless thing. I placed everything into a brown cardboard box and carried it toward my truck. I did not know that my neighbor across the road, Evelyn Price, had stepped onto her porch with her phone in her hand. Evelyn had lived there almost 24 years. She and Margaret traded tomatoes in summer, watched each other's houses during vacations, and stood together at the mailbox long enough to know every marriage has weather no one else sees. She recorded only 17 seconds, no speech, no music, just me walking down the driveway holding one box against my chest while the front door closed behind me. She posted it to a neighborhood Facebook group with a caption I wish she had not written because it was too honest. This is Thomas Bennett. He built this home with his wife over nearly 4 decades. She died last month. Today he carried his memories out after the house was sold without him understanding what he signed. By dinner, 17 seconds had become 40,000 views. By the next morning, it had crossed 500,000. I did not know any of this until my phone began filling with messages from people I had not spoken to in years, former co-workers, retired engineers, parents of young men who once interned under me. One message simply said, Tom, tell me this isn't true. Another said, do you need a lawyer? I turned my phone face down and made coffee. I had never wanted strangers involved in my family, but the internet does not ask permission before it remembers something for you. Someone found the county property record. Someone else posted the closing date. Then a retired title officer explained in a comment that the sale had been executed through a power of attorney only weeks after Margaret's death. By noon, another person had found Mercer Alpine Holdings and connected it to Douglas Mercer's Breckenridge development. Ryan's name appeared in the filing as an advisory investor. What had been a sad neighborhood video became a question people wanted answered. Why had a 72-year-old widower's house money ended up inside his daughter-in-law's family project? I stayed out of it. That part matters. I did not post Ryan's name. I did not share Margaret's notebook. I did not call the television stations that left messages. I did not sit in front of a camera and call my son a thief. I had spent my career learning that facts are strongest when you stop decorating them. The truth was already moving without me. By that afternoon, a reporter from the Loveland Reporter Herald called and asked whether I would comment. I told her only this. My wife died. I trusted my son. I signed something I should have read. The rest should be determined by the records. She asked if I believed Ryan had intended to deceive me. I looked at Margaret's black notebook sitting on the passenger seat of my truck. Intent is a word people use when they are not ready to talk about consequences, I said. That sentence became the headline beneath my photograph the next morning. I hated seeing my face there. Margaret would have hated it more. The article spread beyond Loveland. Denver stations picked it up. A finance blog posted a timeline. People began digging through older planning documents tied to Mercer Ridge. Most of what they found meant little to me, but one thing did. A woman named Evelyn Price left a comment beneath the newspaper article. I had known her for decades, but I did not know she had been inside our kitchen 10 days before Margaret died. Her comment read, Margaret told me directly she did not want that house sold. She said, Thomas can leave it someday if he chooses, but no one is taking him out of it while he is still breathing. I was there. I heard her. I called Evelyn immediately. She answered on the first ring and began apologizing before I could speak. Tom, I should have told you sooner. Tell me what happened, she said. Margaret had been sitting at the kitchen table under a blanket, weak from treatment but completely lucid. Claire had visited earlier that afternoon. Evelyn arrived afterward with soup. Margaret was angry, which was rare. Claire had apparently raised the subject of selling the house again, saying Ryan and Douglas could turn dead equity into something useful. Margaret told Evelyn she had refused. Not politely, not ambiguously, refused. She said Ryan knew. Evelyn told me. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. She said that? Exactly that. She said, Ryan knows how I feel. He knows this house is Thomas's security. I closed my eyes. Until that moment, some small part of me had still been protecting my son with the possibility that he had misunderstood his mother. That possibility disappeared. Ryan had known. He had known while she was alive. He had known after she died. And he had still sat across from me 3 days after her funeral and said, Mom wanted us to move on. I thanked Evelyn and hung up. I did not call Ryan. There are truths that become smaller when you shout them. That evening, the story reached over 3 million views across different platforms. Jonathan sent me one message. My compliance team has seen the coverage. Do nothing. Let them work. I answered with one word. Understood. Across town, Ryan was sitting in his office at Summit Structural Solutions, a mid-sized Denver engineering and development consultancy where he served as director of regional partnerships. He had apparently spent most of the day ignoring the online story, telling coworkers it was a private family misunderstanding being exaggerated by social media. At 4:38 p.m., his laptop chimed. An email arrived from the office of the chief legal and compliance officer. The subject line was short enough to fit on one line. Mandatory review, Ryan Bennett. He opened it, and for the first time since all of this began, my son understood that what happened to me was no longer staying inside the family. Ryan told me later that the email from Summit Structural Solutions looked ordinary at first. No red banner, no threat, just a subject line. Mandatory review, Ryan Bennett. He opened it at 4:38 Thursday afternoon and read the first paragraph 3 times. Effective immediately, he was placed on administrative suspension pending a review of potential conflicts of interest, misuse of authority, and reputational risk connected to Mercer Ridge. His building access was disabled. He was not to contact clients, partners, or the media. He called Claire first. She answered on the 4th ring. This is because of your father, she said before he could explain. He let that video spread. He talked to the paper. He knew what he was doing. Ryan reminded her that I had barely spoken publicly. Don't defend him, she snapped. If Thomas had stayed quiet, none of this would be happening. That sentence bothered him because he knew I had stayed quiet. His next call was Douglas Mercer. Douglas answered, but there was no concern in his voice. How exposed are we? He asked. Not, are you all right? Not, what did the company say? Just how exposed are we? Ryan tried to explain the suspension. Douglas cut him off. I need to know whether Summit has access to our investor schedules or any correspondence involving Hale Meridian. Ryan froze. I may lose my job. Jobs can be replaced, Douglas said. A $400 million development cannot. Ryan told me later that was the first crack. Douglas was not treating him like family. He was treating him like a useful piece of the project that had suddenly become risky. Ryan left through the parking garage because security had already disabled his badge. He drove home to Denver in silence. Claire was in the kitchen with her laptop open and legal pads spread across the island. Douglas says the project is fine, she said. Ryan set his keys down. Did you hear the part where I got suspended? Temporarily. Because of Mercer Ridge. Because your father turned a private issue into a spectacle. Ryan stared at her. He didn't post the video. He didn't stop it either. For the first time, Ryan seemed to hear what had always been beneath Claire's calm voice. Responsibility moved away from her family and landed somewhere else. He asked where the house money was. Claire blinked once. Invested. In what account? Ryan, we've been through this. No, you and your father went through it. I signed the investor forms. You handled the transfer. Show me where the money went. She closed the laptop. You're upset. Show me. She did not move. That was when suspicion became fear. Ryan opened the folder where they kept financial records and found the original wire confirmation. The proceeds from my house had first gone into an investment account established through the authority he used to sell the property. But 11 days later, there was a second transfer he had never seen. $540,000 moved into Mercer Alpine Management LLC, a private company owned entirely by Douglas Mercer. Ryan read the line twice. What is Mercer Alpine Management? Claire crossed her arms. The management entity. That isn't the project company. It supports the project. Why did $540,000 go there? Dad needed to position the capital before closing. Ryan looked up. Did I authorize this? Claire said nothing. He checked the electronic records on his phone. His signature appeared on the initial investment agreement, but not on the secondary transfer. The authorization code attached to the wire request came from Claire's device. "You moved it," he said. "You moved Dad's money into your father's private company. Our money was committed to the project. It was never our money." Claire's face hardened. "You signed the power of attorney. You sold the house. Don't stand here now and pretend I did this alone." That landed because it was true. Ryan had crossed the first line himself. Claire had simply kept walking after he stopped looking. He called Douglas and asked for the money back. Douglas answered without hesitation. "Not possible." "Why?" "It has been deployed." "Into what?" A pause. "Operating obligations." Ryan stood at the kitchen window. "You told me it was invested in land acquisition. Capital is fungible, Ryan. That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you need tonight." Douglas hung up. Ryan remained at the window for a long time. When he turned around, Claire had reopened her laptop. "You knew," he said. She did not answer. He went upstairs, shut the bedroom door, and opened his banking app. For 3 weeks, Ryan had assumed the remaining funds were untouched. He entered the password, waited for the account to load, and stared at the balance. More than $600,000 had passed through that account. What remained was $1,842.17. Ryan did not call me that night. I learned later that he sat on the edge of his bed until sunrise, staring at the number $1,842.17 as if enough time might make the missing money reappear. While my son was beginning to understand what he had helped set in motion, Jonathan Hale was doing something different. He was reading, not social media posts, not headlines, documents, contracts, wire records, partnership agreements, construction schedules. He called me and asked if I still had Margaret's notebook. I told him it had not left my sight. "Bring it," he said. "There are things in our files that don't make sense." I drove to a conference room where Jonathan had gathered 2 attorneys and Hale Meridian's head of compliance. They treated Margaret's notebook like evidence. Page by page, they compared her dates with transaction records tied to Douglas Mercer and Mercer Ridge. Margaret had written that Douglas once asked Ryan whether family property could be converted into working capital without creating unnecessary tax noise. Jonathan's attorney found an internal Mercer memo from the same week discussing private capital sources connected to Bennett family real estate. Margaret had recorded a dinner 2 years earlier at which Douglas bragged about using one company to carry costs that belonged to another until permanent financing arrived. Jonathan's compliance officer stopped reading. "That can be legal," she said, "if it's disclosed. Here, it wasn't." They pulled older records. The deeper they went, the less Mercer Ridge looked like a risky project, and the more it looked like a machine built to move money between entities until no investor could easily tell where it had gone. Vendor invoices were paid by companies that had no contracts with the vendors. Deposits listed as land acquisition had covered payroll at another Mercer business. Investor contributions were restricted in one document and unrestricted in another. Together, it formed a pattern. Jonathan leaned back. "Douglas has been plugging holes with new money. You can brace a damaged structure for a while, but if every new support is holding up the last one, eventually the whole thing depends on nothing failing at once." I turned another page. The entry was dated almost 3 years earlier, long before Margaret's diagnosis. "Douglas told Ryan he could make him a partner someday," she had written. Ryan came home glowing. "I am afraid he wants Douglas's approval more than he wants our respect." Beneath it, Margaret had underlined one sentence twice. "If Ryan ever gives him access to family money, Douglas will use him until there is nothing left to use." I stopped reading. Margaret had seen nearly all of it and never told me. Jonathan must have read the question on my face because he said, "There's more near the back." I turned to the final section. Margaret's handwriting grew shakier there. One entry described a conversation she had with Ryan in the hospital parking garage. She told him she knew Douglas was discussing the house. Ryan promised her he would never touch it without my full consent. Margaret wrote, "I wanted to believe him, so I chose to. Maybe that was weakness. Maybe it was motherhood." Then came the sentence that hurt more than anything else in the book. Thomas would confront him now, and if Thomas pushes too hard, Ryan will run toward Claire and Douglas just to prove he is not still his father's boy. I need to leave him room to come back on his own. That was why she had stayed silent. She was protecting Ryan from the collision she feared would happen if I learned too soon what our son was becoming. She believed there was still a decent man inside him, and she was willing to carry the knowledge alone to give that man time to return. I closed the notebook now. Then the compliance officer placed a spreadsheet on the table. "Mr. Bennett, we traced the money from your home sale. Most entered Mercer Alpine Management, but within 48 hours, portions were distributed to 3 other entities. 2 appear to have been covering overdue obligations unrelated to Mercer Ridge." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "How much?" "At least $380,000. Ryan had believed he was investing my future. Claire had moved the money. Douglas had used it to keep older problems alive. Everyone had told themselves a different story, but money leaves a trail. Jonathan asked permission to copy the relevant notebook pages for his legal team. I agreed. Before I left, he walked me to the elevator. Thomas, this has moved beyond whether Hale Meridian funds the project. I understand. No, he said. I don't think you do yet. His phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed. He stepped away, answered, listened for less than a minute, then returned. Who was that? I asked. Jonathan looked toward the closed conference room door. The FBI. The FBI did not arrive with sirens. That surprised me. Jonathan explained later that most financial investigations begin with phone calls, subpoenas, requests for records, and people in expensive offices suddenly realizing every email they ever wrote may be read by someone who does not care what they intended. Within 48 hours, Hale Meridian froze all discussions involving Mercer Ridge. Their attorneys notified Douglas that no capital would move until the source and use of every investor dollar had been verified. 2 banks followed. Then the county suspended several pending permits after questions surfaced about financial disclosures attached to the development. By Monday morning, Mercer Ridge had not officially died, but it had stopped breathing. Contractors paused work. Vendors demanded payment. Investors called Douglas instead of returning his calls. The project had been built on confidence, and confidence disappears faster than money when people realize both may have been borrowed. Douglas Mercer was served with a federal subpoena at his Denver office just before lunch. Ryan heard about it from Claire, who called him sounding more angry than frightened. "Do you understand what your father has done?" she said. Ryan was sitting alone at their kitchen table. He had been suspended for 4 days and still had not heard whether Summit intended to terminate him. "My father didn't subpoena Douglas. He started this." "No," Ryan said quietly. "We did." Claire went silent. Ryan told me later it was the first time he had said those words aloud. "We did. Not Dad. Not the internet. Not some reporter. We." Claire apparently did not like that answer. "You're becoming emotional," she said, "and you're becoming dangerous to yourself." That afternoon, she came home carrying a leather folder. Ryan recognized the logo of a downtown Denver law firm embossed in one corner. She placed it on the kitchen island between them. "What is this?" he asked. Claire did not sit down. "A petition for dissolution." He stared at her. "You're divorcing me? I'm protecting myself." The sentence sounded familiar because Douglas had taught his family to speak about relationships the way other people spoke about insurance policies. Claire explained that her attorneys believed federal investigators might examine every shared account, every transfer, every document connected to Mercer entities. Separating their finances immediately would establish that she was not responsible for decisions Ryan had made under the power of attorney. Ryan almost laughed. "Decisions I made?" He opened the folder. Claire's petition described the sale of my house as an action initiated and executed primarily by Ryan. Her name appeared only where necessary. The secondary wire into Douglas's company was described as an administrative transfer made at Ryan's direction. Ryan looked up. "You authorized that wire from your device, at your request. That never happened." Claire's expression did not move. "Then I suppose investigators will decide." In that moment, Ryan finally understood how thoroughly he had been positioned. He had been useful when he could provide access to property, credibility, and family money. Now that the structure was failing, he was becoming the support everyone wanted removed first. Claire packed that evening and went to stay with her parents. Douglas never called Ryan, not once. 2 days later, federal agents interviewed him for nearly 3 hours. They asked about the power of attorney, my signature, the sale, Mercer Alpine Management, and what Margaret had told him before she died. Ryan answered most of it without an attorney at first, because he had spent his entire adult life believing that if he explained himself clearly enough, people would understand he was not a bad man. Eventually, one agent asked, "Did your father threaten legal action against you?" Ryan hesitated. "I assume his attorney has." The agent looked at another document. "We have no civil complaint filed by Thomas Bennett." Ryan frowned. "What? Your father has not sued you. He has not filed a criminal complaint against you either." Ryan stared at him. "Then why are you here?" The agent closed the folder. "Because other records raised questions." That answer stayed with him. After the interview, Ryan called Harold Finch, Margaret's attorney. Harold would not discuss confidential details, but he confirmed one thing. I had never asked him to sue Ryan. I had never tried to recover the house through litigation. I had never demanded that Jonathan destroy Mercer Ridge. I had done almost nothing except hand Margaret's notebook to people qualified to examine what it contained. Ryan called me that night. I watched his name appear on my phone and let it ring until the screen went dark. He called again. I did not answer. Not because I wanted him to suffer. Margaret had written something in her letter that I had read dozens of times. "Do not rescue him from the truth, Thomas. If Ryan ever loses himself, love him enough to let him find the road back without carrying him there." So I kept the promise. Ryan spent that night alone in the house he and Claire had bought after their wedding. He wandered from room to room, looking at things that suddenly seemed to belong to a life that had already ended. Near midnight, he began taking down family photographs because seeing our faces had become unbearable. One frame contained a picture of Margaret, Ryan, and me standing beside a lake when he was 16. As he pulled the photograph from the frame, another picture slipped from behind it and fell face down onto the floor. Ryan picked it up. It was older, faded at the edges, and he had never seen it before. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, were 6 words: "For Ryan, when he finally understands." The photograph stayed in Ryan's hands for nearly 10 minutes before he noticed the faded pencil mark in the lower right corner. It was nothing more than a sequence of numbers followed by 2 letters, but something about the way Margaret had written them told him they were never meant to be forgotten. He searched through every drawer in the living room until he found an old county map his mother used to keep for weekend drives through northern Colorado. The numbers pointed to a parcel of land west of Loveland, a place Ryan remembered visiting only once as a child. He could barely remember the trip itself, only that his parents had laughed more that day than they usually did, and that his mother kept telling him, "One day you'll understand why your father loves building things that outlive him." While Ryan was trying to make sense of the photograph, Jonathan Hale called and asked if he could stop by my house. His voice carried none of the confidence I had heard during our previous meetings. Instead, there was the careful tone of a man who had just uncovered something that no longer belonged in a financial investigation. When he arrived, he placed the photograph on my kitchen table without saying a word. The moment I saw it, memories I had buried for decades returned with startling clarity. 36 years earlier, Margaret and I had worked together on the restoration plans for Red Canyon Bridge, a small steel truss bridge crossing the Big Thompson River. Officially, I had been the lead structural engineer, but anyone who knew us understood that Margaret had designed half the ideas people later praised me for. She was never trained as an engineer. She simply had an extraordinary eye for solving problems that others overlooked. Every evening, after Ryan had fallen asleep, we spread blueprints across the dining table, drinking cold coffee while arguing over support angles, drainage channels, and reinforcement joints. Those nights became some of the happiest memories of our marriage. When the project was completed, we quietly stored every original drawing, calculation, field notebook, and handwritten correction in a rented archive unit outside Loveland. Margaret insisted they should never be sold, no matter how valuable they became. "These papers aren't worth anything because they're rare," she once told me. "They're valuable because they remind us of who we were before life became complicated." Jonathan listened without interrupting. Then he told me Hale Meridian had already received 2 private offers from collectors interested in purchasing historical engineering archives connected to major Colorado infrastructure projects. Apparently, Red Canyon Bridge had recently been listed among the state's most influential preservation projects, making the original design documents surprisingly valuable. One buyer had already offered nearly $400,000 for the collection, without even inspecting every document. Jonathan leaned forward. "Thomas, if you donated everything to the Colorado Infrastructure Museum, they'd preserve Margaret's work forever. They'd probably build an exhibit around the 2 of you." I smiled for the first time in weeks. "And if I sold them? You'd never have to worry about money again." I looked toward the window where Margaret's maple tree stood almost bare against the autumn sky. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. "Jonathan," I finally said, "people keep assuming this story is about money. It isn't?" I slowly shook my head. "The house wasn't the gift Margaret left me." He frowned. "Then what was?" I reached into the old storage box beside my chair and lifted out the first blueprint Margaret had ever signed beside my own name. The paper had yellowed with age, and one corner had been repaired with tape decades earlier. "This," Jonathan studied the drawing. "A bridge?" "No," I smiled again. "A life." I explained that anyone could buy lumber, concrete, or land. Anyone with enough money could purchase the house Ryan had sold. But nobody, not Douglas Mercer, not Claire, not the collectors offering hundreds of thousands of dollars, could ever buy the years Margaret and I had poured into those pages. Every correction mark represented an argument that ended in laughter. Every coffee stain came from nights we refused to stop working because we believed we were building something that would still be standing after we were gone. The blueprints were never our treasure. They were simply proof that 2 ordinary people had built something meaningful together. Jonathan closed the folder and nodded slowly. "I understand now." "No," I answered gently. "You understand why I won't sell them." As evening settled over the mountains, I locked the archive once again. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I felt no desire to reclaim the house. The walls had never been the inheritance she wanted me to protect. The inheritance was the life we had shared inside them. That night, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, A slow knock echoed through my front door. I already knew who it was before I looked through the window. Ryan stood alone on the porch, soaked by the cold rain, holding the old photograph tightly against his chest. The knock came a second time, softer than the first. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, yet I had not been asleep. At my age, grief has a way of replacing sleep with long conversations that never leave your own mind. I opened the front door without asking who it was. Ryan stood there in the cold rain, soaked through, holding the faded photograph Margaret had hidden behind the family portrait. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, not because of the beard he had forgotten to shave or the circles beneath his eyes, but because certainty had finally abandoned him. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere left to hide. He lowered his eyes, stepped onto the porch, and without saying a word, dropped to both knees. I watched him for several seconds before speaking. "You'll catch pneumonia out here." He shook his head. "I deserve worse than that." The words drifted away with the rain. I did not answer immediately. Anger had visited me many times over the previous weeks, but it had never stayed. Pain remained. Disappointment remained. Love remained, though I sometimes wished it would leave, if only to make everything simpler. "Come inside," I said. Ryan followed me into the kitchen where the old coffee pot still sat exactly where Margaret had left it months before. He remained standing while I sat down. "Dad," his voice broke before he could finish. "I know." "No," he whispered, "you don't." Tears finally came. Not the loud, desperate kind, but the quiet tears of a man watching the life he believed he wanted collapse beneath him. "I destroyed everything." I looked at him carefully. "No, you damaged many things. That's different." He covered his face with both hands. "I thought I was building something. Claire said Douglas believed in me. I thought if I succeeded, you'd finally be proud of me." I almost smiled at the irony. "Ryan, I was proud of you the day you learned to ride a bicycle without looking back to see if I was still holding the seat." He looked up confused. "I never stopped being proud because of what you earned. I stopped recognizing you because of what you were willing to trade away." Silence settled between us. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen window Margaret had insisted should face the maple trees. After several minutes I stood, walked into the hallway, and opened the small wooden cabinet beside the stairs. From the top shelf I removed a worn leather pouch that had belonged to my father. Inside was an old silver pocket watch scratched along its edges, its glass replaced twice over the years. I placed it on the table in front of Ryan. He stared at it. "Grandpa's watch." I nodded. "He carried it every day for 47 years. Ryan picked it up carefully. "I thought it was lost." "No. I kept it because your grandfather asked me to give it to the man you became." Ryan closed his fingers around it, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't deserve it." Neither did I when he gave it to me. I leaned back in my chair and remembered the winter afternoon my father placed that same watch into my hand after I made an expensive mistake on my first construction project. I expected him to yell. Instead, he said something I have never forgotten. "A man's reputation isn't built by the mistakes he avoids. It's built by the mistakes he refuses to hide." I repeated those words to Ryan exactly as I had heard them 50 years earlier. "Your grandfather told me that honor isn't the absence of failure. Honor begins the moment a man stops looking for someone else to blame." Ryan turned the watch over slowly. On the inside cover, beneath years of wear, the old engraving was still there. "Integrity outlasts success." His shoulders began to shake. "Mom knew," he whispered. I did not interrupt. "She told me not to sell the house." His voice became almost impossible to hear. "She asked me in the hospital parking lot if I promised I would protect you. I said I would." He closed his eyes. I lied. The confession seemed to empty something inside him. I knew she didn't want the house touched. I knew she believed Douglas was using me. I knew, and I stayed quiet because I wanted the deal to happen. I kept telling myself I'd buy you an even better house later. I convinced myself the result would erase the way I got there. He looked at me with the expression of a frightened little boy rather than the successful executive he had tried so hard to become. "Can you ever forgive me?" I looked toward Margaret's empty chair before answering. "Forgiveness was never the difficult part." Ryan frowned. "Then what is?" "Trust." The room became still again. I could see him waiting for punishment, for anger, for the speech he had probably rehearsed 100 times on the drive over. Instead, I poured 2 cups of coffee. One for myself, one for my son. We drank in silence until the first hint of dawn began to soften the darkness outside the kitchen window. Finally, Ryan stood. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I'll sign anything. I'll testify. I'll give back everything I have." I looked at the old pocket watch resting in his palm. Then I thought about Margaret's letter, her notebook, and the promise I had made to the woman I loved. "Those things matter," I said quietly, "but they aren't the first step." Ryan waited. I met his eyes for the first time that night. "Son," I said, my voice calm but steady, "you still have one thing left to do." The morning after Ryan left my house, the old pocket watch was gone from my kitchen table. For the first time in months, I found myself hoping that was a good thing. 3 days later, Jonathan Hale called to tell me the federal investigation had entered its formal stage. Douglas Mercer had been ordered to produce years of financial records, investor communications, and internal accounting documents. Ryan had contacted the investigators before they contacted him. He arrived carrying every email, contract, wire confirmation, and notebook he still possessed. He answered every question without asking for favors or immunity. Jonathan told me the agents were surprised by one thing more than anything else. Ryan never once tried to minimize what he had done. When they asked why he had come forward voluntarily, he simply said, "Because my father spent my entire childhood teaching me that the truth eventually costs less than the lie." Hearing those words brought tears to my eyes for the first time since Margaret's funeral. Not because my son had finally become the man I wanted him to be, but because somewhere beneath years of pride and ambition, that little boy I had raised had survived after all. Within 2 months, Mercer Ridge officially collapsed. Investors withdrew. Banks terminated their financing agreements. Douglas Mercer resigned from every company he controlled before federal fraud charges were announced. Claire filed amended statements admitting she had authorized several financial transfers under her father's direction. She never contacted me again. I never wished her harm. I simply hoped that one day she would understand the difference between building wealth and building a life. Ryan never spoke badly about her. When Jonathan asked him why, Ryan answered, "I made my own choices. Blaming someone else would only prove I still haven't learned anything." The house Margaret and I built was never returned to me. The family who bought it had acted in good faith, and I would never ask innocent people to lose their home because of our tragedy. I drove past it only once after everything ended. The maple trees Margaret planted were taller than I remembered. Children's bicycles rested beside the garage. Someone had hung a swing beneath the old oak tree. I smiled as I drove away. Houses are meant to shelter families. Ours was finally doing that again. Several weeks later, Jonathan invited me to the Colorado Infrastructure Museum. He had quietly purchased every original bridge drawing, engineering note, field journal, and design sketch that collectors had tried to acquire after news of our story spread. Instead of placing them in a private collection, he donated everything in Margaret's name. The museum dedicated an entire gallery to community engineering and named the annual scholarship for young civil engineering students the Margaret Bennett Memorial Scholarship. Standing beneath her photograph while young students read the blueprints we had drawn together all those years ago, I realized Margaret had been right. Our greatest work had never been the bridge itself. It was the lives that bridge continued to serve long after we were gone. Ryan did not return to engineering. He said he no longer trusted himself to build skyscrapers until he first rebuilt his own character. He began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that constructed accessible homes for disabled veterans across Colorado. The first Saturday I visited one of their sites, I found him carrying lumber beside men who had no idea he had once managed million-dollar developments. He never introduced himself by his old job title. He simply said, "I'm Ryan, tell me where you need me." Watching him measure walls, hammer roof trusses, and stay long after everyone else had gone home reminded me of the boy who used to hand me nails while I repaired our old porch. Redemption, I discovered, rarely arrives in dramatic speeches. More often, it arrives disguised as ordinary work repeated every single day. One quiet evening, I unlocked the small wooden box beside my chair and laid everything Margaret had left behind across the kitchen table. The brass key rested beside the black notebook. The notebook lay next to her final letter. My father's pocket watch ticked softly in the silence after Ryan returned it to me with a note that read, "I'm still trying to become the man Grandpa believed I could be." Finally, I placed an old photograph of our house beside them all. For weeks I had believed those objects represented everything I had lost. I finally understood they represented everything I had been given. The key had opened the truth. The notebook had protected it. The letter had guided me through it. The watch had reminded my son who he came from. And the house had never been the inheritance at all. It had only been the place where the real inheritance was created. Love, integrity, sacrifice, faithfulness. Those things could never be sold because they had never belonged to the walls. That night I read Margaret's final letter one last time. Near the bottom she had written words I somehow needed months to understand. "Thomas, if Ryan ever finds his way back, don't welcome him because he deserves it. Welcome him because mercy is what made us a family in the first place." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into its envelope. Then I looked through the kitchen window toward the stars above the Colorado mountains and whispered, "You were right, Maggie, again." If this story has reminded you of someone who quietly sacrificed for your family, take a moment today to tell them what they mean to you while you still can. Leave a comment and share where you're watching from. Your stories remind all of us that kindness, integrity, and forgiveness still matter. And if you believe that quiet strength can outlast pride, Consider joining us for more stories like this. As for me, I have learned something no engineer ever taught me. A father can't choose the mistakes his children make. He can only choose whether his own heart stays open when they finally find their way home.